So this chapter is all about the muscle. And one of the interesting things about muscle is compared to the other tissues in the body, muscle can produce a force, right? So that's pretty unique. The other tissues in the body, bone, ligament, tendon, skin, cartilage, they're all helpful. They all do things. They're all part of the body, but they don't produce a force. And one thing that's interesting about a force is that forces cause masses to accelerate. So forces cause masses to accelerate. Force equals ma. That's Newton's second law. Right? That's an interesting thing. The very thing that's attached or in your body creates this force, which makes masses, which are your limbs, accelerate, which is change or go from not, Christopher's in here. They make your muscle go from not moving to moving. And that's or your limbs go from not moving to moving. This is something that is unique to muscle that you should really consider, because muscle is the thing that is going to make your body not only move, but also stop, right? Everybody's heard of concentric muscle contractions and eccentric muscle contractions. Well, what a concentric muscle contraction is when you're going against gravity. Usually you're doing a bicep curl. You're lifting something away from gravity. You're overcoming gravity's pull. And if that's the case, what you're doing is you're generating power. An eccentric muscle contraction, the weight is being lowered. The weight is lowering down and you're slowing down gravity's pull by pulling in the opposite direction of gravity. And in that case, it's a muscle absorption. So when you're talking about concentric muscle contractions and generating power, it's like the gas pedal. Concentric muscle contractions are like pressing the gas pedal. It generates power away from gravity. But eccentric muscle contractions are more like the brake pedal. They slow things down. So your muscles are unique. They make your body move. They make masses accelerate. And they also allow your body to slow down. So if you can only make your body do concentric muscle contractions and you're not strong enough eccentric muscle contraction wise, then you have a difficult time slowing your body down and keeping your body and the forces going through your body dissipated and keeping your tissues healthy. But anyway, so muscle is a unique tissue for sure. And we've already started talking about its physiology in some manners. All right, muscle has this hierarchical, and I know I don't want to keep kind of pounding on this word, but even the structure of muscle that we're going to talk about right now implies a hierarchy. And let me remind you, a hierarchy is anytime you have like a top-down structure where like this top thing is the most important, like it's the president. And then underneath there is maybe like the 2 VPs. And then underneath that, you have even more delegation underneath that, and even more delegation underneath that, right? So this is like a top-down structure. The anatomy of skeletal muscle, as well as the anatomy of ligament and tendon, is also made in this hierarchical muscle structure kind of thing. Oh man, I hope I can do this without erasing everything again. Probably not. Admit. Nice. So what that means is that you have a muscle fiber. I'm going to erase this over here now that you understand what the hierarchical muscle hierarchy is. Your muscle is kind of similar in the sense that a muscle looks like this. Like you're going to have your muscle belly. And then at the end of the muscle, you're going to have your tendons, because tendons attach muscle to bone. And then in the middle here is your muscle. So this is tendon, And then you're going to have these little striations in the muscle. So this is what your muscle is going to look like if I like take your bicep off of your arm. But then if I take your bicep and I slice it like that, and I look into the bicep, what it would look like is this. Let me erase a little bit here. What it would look like is this. So you would have your muscle here, and then you would have your slice and your tendon. And inside here, there would be like these little pockets of muscle, like little sections of muscle. And then within those sections, there's going to be even smaller sections of muscle. And eventually, the very smallest, these little fibers that you see here are your muscle fibers or your myofibrils. All right, so if I take one of these out, it's going to be packed with all these. Myo is muscle and fibrils is like fibers. And each one of those muscle fibers is going to look kind of like this. It's going to be like a long strand. I mean, for some muscles, it's going to be longer than others, you know, and it's, I don't know, it's not going to necessarily be this shape or whatever, but it's going to have a bunch of these different striations to it. And it's these striations, which are called sarcomeres, which is where the actin and the myosin is. That is all about the sliding filament theory. Now, I'm not going to get into the theoretical stuff about the sliding filament anymore. I don't want to mislead you or like steer you in the wrong direction in terms of learning, but you know, it's up to you to figure out what's going on. But it's the sliding filament theory that is leading to muscle contraction. So there's a bunch of different types of muscle. We're going to really think about muscle, skeletal muscle, but you have heart muscle and the muscle in between your organs and other types of muscle. And we're going to talk about specifically skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle has these motor units, and a motor unit is a neuron that comes from the brain, and eventually it's going to go to the muscle, and that neuron is going to, so you have this neuron that goes from the brain, it goes to the muscle, and the neuron is going to attach to a bunch of different muscle fibers. So a motor unit is the neuron that comes from the brain, the alpha motor neuron, and all of the muscle fibers that that particular neuron interacts with within that muscle. And then those muscle fibers are going to be recruited by the brain, right, through electrical signals, the action potential. And then depending upon the muscle fiber type, whether or not it's a fast twitch or a slow twitch muscle fiber, those muscles will be used to do particular movements, whether or not it's activities of daily living. But in this case, in this class, we're going to always go back to exercise physiology. So we're assuming people are exercising. So we're going to always go back and talk about athletics and exercise and how muscles are kind of used to do exercise, and not just used in terms of like, you know, ATP and blood flow and stuff, but like, what is a muscle? What is a muscle, right? A muscle is a thing that makes your body move forward, right? But it's also the thing that makes your body stop. So if you can't make your body stop, it's like the gas pedal and the brake pedal. It's the same thing, right? If you have no brakes and you get the car to start moving and you have no brakes, you're in trouble. There's going to be an accident. You know, so, or if you don't have enough fuel, you don't have enough gasoline to get the car to move, then you also have an issue, right? So you have to think about like, how do you, and then the thing about the gas pedal and the brake pedal is it's not whether or not you have one or don't have one, it's whether or not you use them at the right time. Like if you're trying to use the brake pedal, but you find that you use it 2 seconds too late, you're already too late. You're in the accident already. So the thing about muscle is muscle timing. The timing between eccentric and concentric muscle contraction is important, not just the overall ability to utilize eccentric and concentric muscle contraction. That's why progression and like off-season drills and keeping yourself in timing is pretty important. All right, anytime anybody has a question, feel free to let me know, but I want to go to the next slide. So we talked about the different types of muscle. There's muscle that's around your organs, there's muscles in your heart. But we're going to talk about skeletal muscle, muscle that comes from a voluntary reaction. But this is also a little bit of a questionable word here. Let's go back to here, just because it's fun to talk about. So, you know, the book will throw out these words here that you might not even thought of, right? It says it right there, voluntary. But what's voluntary? What does voluntary mean? Jameson, you're right there on my screen, so I'm going to talk to you for a bit. What does voluntary mean to you?
Voluntary means like you can control it. So like I can control moving my hand like this, but I can't control like my heart beating.
So, I mean, so parasympathetic, sympathetic and sympathetic nervous, actions, those are not things that you can control, you know, sometimes. I guess you can't do biofeedback, but, and then there's other things like, you know, grasping things or picking up a coffee cup that you're cognitive about. But let's just talk about this. So let me think about a voluntary action. Okay, voluntary is something that you think of. So, and something that's reflective is something that is not thought of. It's not cognitive. Is that okay to say, Jameson?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Do you know what? So when I was getting my doctorate, somebody gave us this thought experiment, and it was like to try to break down what you thought was reflective, what was like a reflex, and what was learnable, and what was voluntary or not. So let's say, Jameson, that you're going to reach for a coffee cup and you're thirsty, you're listening to me, you want to reach for a coffee cup. Is that a voluntary action?
I would say yeah.
I would agree. Is it a cognitive action?
Would that also be yes?
Yeah. None of this stuff is tricky. I'm not trying to trick you. Right? So it's a voluntary cognitive action. You're thinking, man, am I thirsty? I want to get something to drink. Okay? So that's something that uses your brain. But one of the interesting things about it is that when you go to reach for the cup, what is the first muscle that fires? And I know that you might not exactly know the name of the muscle or whatever, but intuitively, if I'm going to go reach for the cup with my right hand, Jameson, in a voluntary cognitive action, a thought of action, I go to reach with my right hand, which muscles fire first?
It's going to be the muscles in your right arm that are like allowing you to move your shoulder and your elbow.
You would think that would be intuitive, right? But there's actually a reflex that happens before your arm moves in order to stabilize your body. The left side lower back muscles fire because when you lift up your right hand, it's going to make you top heavy and you'll fall over. So in order for you to lift your hand up in the first place, your left side lower back muscles clench up and stabilize your core. Now that's a reflex, right? But it came from a voluntary action. You know what I mean? So like, I can't tell which is which anymore. Right? So is it a reflex or is that voluntary? And now what happens is like these words get thrown out and I'm supposed to go quickly past them. But you have to think now, like, I don't even know what a voluntary action is anymore. I'll go with Alice. Alice, do you know what a Babinski test? I have a little baby and I do a Babinski test. Do you know what a Babinski test is? Ever heard of that before?
Is that with the fingers?
Well, I mean, I guess you
Maybe
keep going.
not.
Keep
Never
going.
mind.
Well, I'm going to keep going with you anyway because it's fun. All right. So
Okay.
this is what a Babinski test is, Alice. All right. So I'll draw a little teeny foot here. All right. This is a baby's foot. And they have a baby's foot. And it's a newborn baby. And they take a little needle, a little teeny needle, and they prick the foot right at the base, at the bottom of the foot. Right there. Boom. They like stick the foot with a little teeny needle. What do you think, Alice, is going to happen to that foot? What's the baby going to do?
They assume their toes would curl in. But I guess that's what they're testing for, to see if they have that reflex.
Yeah, and like they have like a withdraw pattern. If you take like the needle and you like stick it at the bottom of the foot like retracts and like curls up, exactly what Alice says. But so that's a reflex. That's involuntary action. But what happens if I do it again and I do it again and I do it again and I do it again? All of a sudden the reflex becomes unlearned. So here you have this notion of voluntary motions and movements that have precursory involuntary actions, like I just talked with Jameson about. Like you have a voluntary, I'm going to move my arm to the coffee cup, but we don't even know it starts with a reflex. And now you have reflexive instinctual actions, like pulling your foot away from a needle when it's pricked, that are actually learnable and unlearnable. So for me, the notions of voluntary and learned and unlearned are still now kind of difficult for me to process. Right? I'm not sure what voluntary means when we're talking about skeletal muscle. Maybe it means that I have free will to do what I want to do, but I don't know. I'm not sure. But we have to think about that. Anyway, let's go on to the next couple of slides. For the rest of the course, we're going to be talking about skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle is striated. And if you look at the skeletal muscle, this is what I was talking about before. Smooth muscle is smooth like this. Skeletal muscle has these little, I want to make this bigger. I'm pretty sure I can. That's why I did that last year. That's why I did this. Nice. So if you notice, skeletal muscle has these little striations to it, right? So your muscle has these long bands. And if I take each one of these bands out and I look under a microscope, it's going to look like this. It's going to have these little sections to it. And these sections is where your protein is. Protein is actin and myosin. Actin is one of the proteins in your muscle, and myosin. And these two interact, and when they do, they make a contraction. So each one of these little sections is called a sarcomere. It's one of these little parts here, a sarcomere, and they're held together by all of these little proteins. And when you do strength and conditioning and testosterone and growth factor goes to your muscles and you have hypertrophy, what happens is more and more of these actin and myosin filaments grow and make your muscle bigger and more of these connections. So you would imagine if you had like one person on one side of a rope and you're doing tug of war, and then you have another person over here on the other side of the rope playing tug of war, well, then you're going to get a pretty good matchup, right? But if you want to get stronger, what you'd do is you'd add another person over here and another person over here and another person over here. And then you'd have another maybe person. This wouldn't be a very fun matchup because this team would win. But if you want to have even more fun, then you get more and more people, and the more people that are pulling, and maybe you have even like another rope and another rope and another rope. And then all of a sudden you have like this network, this net that is creating incredible tension. That's pretty much how your muscles are working. It's just instead of little people in here, you have actin and myosin. And this is somewhat why it gets theoretical. Anyway, so let me erase this stuff. And I think I'm going to keep on this because I can manipulate the screen a little bit easier to do that. So let's clear all these drawings and go to the next slide. So your entire muscle is surrounded by these sheaths, right? Your muscles are surrounded by these sheaths called epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. All right, let's see the next slide, or I'll draw it for you, it'll be easier. So what does that mean? That means that your muscle looks like this. And this is one of the things that kind of limits the ability of muscle to heal, is that your muscle looks like this. So I showed you before, you have your tendon, and then you have your muscle belly, and then you have these like striations. And then if I cut the muscle open, well, and then this muscle here is surrounded by a tissue. It's like when you open an onion, like that little kind of like thin tissue comes off of like the layer of the onion, right? Your muscles have the same kind of layer. There's like an outer layer. So if I slice your muscle like this, and I showed you what it looked like, it would look like this. And tendon, whatever, tendon, doesn't matter. Tendon. And then you would have like another section of muscle in here, and a section of muscle in here, and another section of muscle in here, right? And so this outer layer here, the outer layer of the muscle, this layer here, this is called your epimysium. And that's important because it's in these little sheaths that is where the blood flows is. Right? And then you'll have a bunch of different other fibers here, but this is another protective sheath here. And what do these protective sheaths do? First of all, it's where blood flow is, but I'm not sure if anybody's ever seen where in the classroom where the wall jack is, and then you have the Ethernet cable comes out of the wall, and usually it'll go up to like the stand where the professor has the computer, and the computer is sitting on the stand, and it's usually plugged into the Ethernet. And then the professor is looking at the computer, but this cable right here that attaches to the wall, it usually has this weird like mesh covering around it. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Kenzie, you know what I'm talking about? That like that cloth mesh covering, right? Anybody know what that's all about? Why that cloth covering is there? Does anybody a computer person, anybody know what that's all about? All right, what it's supposed to do is the mesh covering, if you look at it, it'll be like this. You have the wire comes through the mesh covering, and the mesh covering looks kind of like this. It almost looks like a spider web. It has fibers going this direction, fibers going in this direction, fibers going in this direction. And what's supposed to happen is if say for instance, the professor forgets that the computer is plugged in, and he lifts up and takes the computer and walks to the other side of the room, instead of ripping the whole jack out of the wall, before the cables take tension, this mesh thing stretches and takes the tension away from the wall, and it actually stops the computer from moving further. It like protects the wall jack from getting ripped out. This sheath right over here protects the inner wires from over tension, from stretching too far. Does that make sense? It like wraps the wires with this protective sheath that will assume the tension before the actual wires that are the most important thing will assume the tension. And it protects the wires, and it also protects the thing against the wall that the wires are connected to. Who cares about the wire? But if this thing in the wall gets ripped out, then like the whole room is a little bit in trouble in terms of audio-visual ability. So they're protecting the wires with this outer cloth sheath that assumes the tension prior to when the actual wires assume the tension. Alice, does that make sense at all? You following what I'm saying? All right, so that's what these surrounding things are doing. They're protecting the muscle from unnecessary tension, and also because these sheaths are organized in multiple directions in terms of their structure, it makes it so that the muscle belly itself can withstand forces from multiple directions and not get ruined, not get torn. Not only that, but it's in these surrounding tissues that's where the blood flow is. Now that's a good thing because it does bring blood flow to the muscle fibers, but you can't get the blood flow directly to the muscle fiber. Bone is different. Bone is like this. So we're not going to go over this too much because we're talking about muscle. But like bone, that's your tibia, right? Bone, there's blood vessels everywhere, all through it, all through the bone, all through the bone. Bone doesn't have these protective sheaths, but for muscle, the blood vessels are only in this thing, or they're only in that sheath, or they're only in that sheath. But when we get down to the individual muscle fiber levels, there's no blood flow in the muscle fibers themselves. So when the muscle fiber themselves gets injured, it takes time for nutrients and blood to get to the muscle fiber. And that really does slow down healing. And that's why if you have like a sprained ankle and you don't rest it, sometimes it takes a good amount of time for that particular muscle to heal. That's why bone usually heals faster than muscle, ligament, or tendon. Now, this is called a hierarchical design or a hierarchical structure of skeletal muscle. You have a big structure that's broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller, and finally the teeniest, smallest structures, which is your muscle fiber. Now, each of these little muscle fibers is divided into sarcomeres, and the muscle fiber will kind of look like this. And by the way, this isn't what a muscle fiber looks like. I'm just drawing something on the screen that might look like what a muscle fiber looks like. So these are all just models, but they're going to have these striations, and each of these striations is a sarcomere. And if I open this sarcomere up and I look at it like in a microscope, it's going to look like this. All right. And this is just a model where you have the ends of the sarcomere are each of these things right here. And then within that, you're going to have these protein filaments. And these protein filaments are going to reach out from the ends of these discs called Z discs, and they're going to attach to these other filaments. And I'm going to show you another drawing of this. And these protein filaments here are the actin and myosin. So when you get down to the very, very like nuts and bolts of everything, the smallest part of one of these muscle fibers is a sarcomere, and it's these sarcomeres where your sliding filament theory, or all of the calcium or all of the actin and myosin is happening. And then what we're going to do is now go into like the muscle fiber structure and take a look at how a muscle contracts pretty much. Does anybody have any questions or anything? All right. Okay, so you have, so let's just keep going. So I'm going to show you what a muscle fiber looks like. This is the protective sheath, and in here is your muscle fibers, your myofibril. All right, it's like a band of muscle fibers, and you'll see in here is where these are your actin and myosin. So this is one myofibril, one muscle fiber packed with actin and myosin. And when you like eat like a steak, you're eating a cow's actin and myosin. That's pretty much what's happening. All right. These are the ends of a sarcomere. So here's a sarcomere. And in the sarcomere, you'll see the blue and the red. That's actin and myosin. Those are your protein filaments. When you do strength and conditioning and you have enough calories and you're building muscle, you're not increasing the numbers of myofibril. When you're born, you have a particular number of muscle fibers, and that's the number that you have still to this day. And when you get bigger, what happens is more actin and myosin goes into these, or is synthesized, or is created. It's actually DNA mutations. And then like trunks of a tree, you know, get bigger and bigger in terms of diameter. That's how your muscles grow. So this is actin and myosin. This is called your sarcoplasmic reticulum. A reticulum is this kind of like a reticulated python. It's like something that is long and goes for like some type of length or something. So this is your sarcoplasm, and it's reticulated. It goes for a long period of time. It goes all the way down your muscle fiber. And this yellow stuff, the sarcoplasm, is where calcium and nutrients are distributed to the muscle fiber. All right. These cross bridges right over here. So you have your sarcoplasm, calcium comes down, and then the calcium will come out of these little tubes here. These are called T-tubules. They're called T-tubules because they look like a T. So they're T-tubules. I don't think I really asked you any questions about all of this little nitpicky stuff. All right. All the questions that I ask are not designed to trick you at all. All right. It's designed for you to have fun and learn while you're being graded and stuff. So just learn to have fun with this stuff. All right. So these are your mitochondria. Mitochondria is where energy is created. Now your body is going to move. Your body moves. Eventually these actin and myosin filaments, they're going to move. They're going to slide across each other. Movement requires energy. Just like if you have a remote control car, it's got to be plugged in. There's got to be a battery. If you have a car, you have to have gasoline, an airplane, energy, energy, energy. If I want to fling the elastic band on my wrist, okay, I got to store energy in it. So movement requires energy. So if your body moves, which it does, it's using energy. So where are you getting energy? You're getting energy from ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We'll get into that in an hour or so. Geez, we have so much to talk about. It's getting energy from breaking down ATP, and this mitochondria is where the ATP is being broken down. Now the ATP is broken down, and that means that like energy, literally energy, is floating around these muscle fibers, and the energy is used directly by your actin and myosin to move. So this is where the energy, the ATP, is broken down. Then another thing that happens is when this muscle fiber here receives an action potential, the action potential is going to allow calcium which is kind of stored in this sarcoplasmic reticulum to kind of like leak out. And when the calcium leaks out of the sarcoplasm and into the muscle fibers, it makes these two proteins called troponin and tropomyosin interact with each other. And then it allows for your muscles to contract, but we'll get into that. All right, does anybody have any questions about what I'm talking about so far? I know there's a lot, but if you have any questions, now, same thing, Jameson. I mean, this is stuff that you're aware of. You've had some of this stuff before in class, or is this totally new to you?
No, I feel like I've definitely learned some of it, whether in like anatomy or like physiology.
Same thing, Alice. Is this stuff, thumbs up? Is this stuff that you've, all right, so, okay. All right, so let's move on. All right, so in these sarcomeres is where your actin and myosin is. So now let's take a look at these actin and myosin. Remember, we talked about actin and myosin as the structural foundation for the sliding filament theory. And the theory says that an action potential is sent from your brain. Annotate, 1 second. So an action potential, that's not a good brain. An action potential is sent from your brain and it goes to your muscle. All right, usually it'll start in the front of your brain, the frontal lobe here is where like voluntary movements come. So you'll have an alpha motor neuron comes from your brain. It'll send an action potential down through the alpha motor neuron, and eventually it'll innervate the motor unit or the muscle fibers that it's intending to innervate. Then the action potential is going to allow for a release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and eventually actin and myosin are going to intertwine with each other. And then, so you have actin, I guess, let's get rid of these, clear all your drawings. So you'll have the Z disc is here. And right now you'll have your actin here. And let's say you have your myosin here, all right, now. Now, right now, let's just, I mean, I might even be wrong. This might be actin, and this might, it doesn't matter. So right now, you can see that there's a problem that you have. Right now, myosin here is too far away from actin to attach to this particular actin site. Same thing here. The muscle is too far spread out for any actin to intertwine with any myosin. That's the same thing as saying like your muscle is all the way contracted here. Let me just do a drawing instead of showing you let's say I do a drawing that looks like this. I have my muscle. Right now, the muscle here is at like 90% of its particular length. Now, if I contracted my arm all the way up like this, then what would happen is the muscle would get smaller. It would contract. If I took the arm and I elongated the arm like this, the muscle would get longer and longer and longer. Now imagine if I took the arm and I made the arm in a situation that looked like this. All right, here's my humerus, here's my elbow, here's my lower arm. and my arm is literally straight and 100 degrees extended. All right, here's my hand. 100 degrees extended. Now my bicep would be as elongated as it can possibly be. My bicep in this situation would be really elongated, as long as the bicep can be. It would be in this situation right here. The actin and the myosin would be so stretched apart that very little actin and very little myosin could actually interact with each other in this situation. So if that's the case, it should be very difficult for my muscle to actually make a contraction when my muscle is totally elongated. So I want you to make your arm completely straight like that, and then try to take a muscle. Try to make a muscle. Like, go do it. Straighten your arm like that, Kenzie. And then go try to make a muscle, and you can't. Right? You can't make a muscle if your muscle is totally elongated, because the actin and myosin are pulled so far away from each other that they can't touch anymore. So in this situation right here, where your muscle is like at 90 degrees, and it's right in the middle of the length that it wants to be, that's a situation where like most of the actin and most of the myosin can interact with each other. And now you can make a pretty forceful muscle contraction, because the actin and myosin can interact with each other. Sorry, this one's a little bit wrong, but you understand. Same thing. If I flex my muscle all the way and I flex my arm all the way this way, then what happens is the actin and myosin kind of cross over each other, and they still can't make a contraction. So the actin and myosin have to kind of be like right in the middle of their resting length, right in the middle of their length, so that they can all intertwine. But when they do, it's like you're in like a crew, like you're in a like one of those like boats. When everybody's working together, boy, do you get a very strong adhesive unit. So when all of the actin and all the myosin are lined up and interacting with each other, that's when your muscles can make good contractions. That's why your body will grab something and hold on to it with your arms at 90 degrees. It's not because your brain said, 90 degrees, that's going to be better for me. I like 90 degrees. The reason why 90 degrees emerges out of nowhere, like length emerged out of nowhere, all right, is because at 90 degrees, grabbing something here at 90 degrees like this, that's when all the actin and myosin are lined up. That's when it's best for you to grab something. So that's why you grab it like that. You don't grab it like that because you sent an action potential to your brain. I don't ever recall saying, I'm going to hold this bag of rice with my arms at 90 degrees. Right? You hold it at 90 degrees because the actin and myosin is intertwined at 90 degrees. You hold it because of the structure of your muscles. You hold it because of what you're trying to do. You hold it because if you don't hold it at 90 degrees, it'll slide off your arms onto the ground. You hold things at 90 degrees, though, because your actin and myosin intertwine. You don't hold things at 90 degrees because you haven't thought of it. So I don't think that holding something at 90 degrees is a voluntary action, Jameson, because I never did that. Right? I think the reason why you do things is not because the brain told us to do it, but because if I don't hold it at 90 degrees, then my actin and myosin don't intertwine, and therefore I'm going to drop whatever it is that I'm trying to hold. So it's not like a brain thing. It's like this 90 degrees thing comes because I have to. It comes because of the structure of my muscle as opposed to this mysterious signal from the brain. Anyway, actin and myosin are the things in your muscles that are like intertwining so that your muscles can not only contract and create a force, but can also absorb forces as well. So let's go to the next drawing. Does anybody have any questions? All right, so let's show you kind of what they look like. So here is the picture of the sarcomere that I showed you before. All right, this sarcomere, now you blow it up. And this sarcomere, like we said, has these red and blue kind of filaments. And the myosin here, the myosin is the blue in the middle. And the actin here is the red. Now, I don't know if you look in a microscope whether or not actin is blue or red or whatever. That's not the point. This is just a model. All right, it's a model to help you guys understand and think and to conceptualize, but I don't know if this is necessarily exactly what it looks like. All right. And each of these muscle fibers is broken down into sarcomeres. And a sarcomere is the distance between one of these Z discs. So this is a Z disc. And a Z disc is the definition, or a definition of a Z disc is where the actin kind of creates a natural divider from one sarcomere to the other. Then if you take each of these Z discs and you blow the Z disc up, it'll look kind of like this. So this is the distance between the ends of the actin here and your myosin. And they'll call myosin a thick filament and actin a thin filament because physically myosin is thicker than actin. And you'll notice here that they have these like globules on the end of each of these myosin filaments. So you see there's a globule here, and then there's like this thing called a cross bridge. And you'll see on this side of the M line, all of the cross bridges are angled away from the M line. And same thing, on this side of the M line, all the cross bridges are angled away. This little filament here is called titin, T-I-T-I-N. And this is pretty much like an elastic band. This is like your muscle here. This is your muscle under like a big, huge, powerful microscope. So if your muscle is dead, let's say you take a bicep out of somebody, like the muscle is now dead. It's not being innervated by a brain or anything like that. It's not going to grow. It's not going to heal. But it still has properties. Like if I took that muscle and it was a dead muscle, like this is a dead elastic band, the muscle would still be able to have some tension in it, the tissue itself. So that is a material property that actually has the ability to store energy. And muscle has an elastic property to it because of that titin, because of that filament titin that's within the actual structure of the muscle itself. And that allows muscle to store elastic energy, like an elastic band. Now, actin and myosin also has what's called an elastic component to it. It has the ability to be an elastic band, similar to titin, but a good amount of the elastic nature of muscle comes from titin. What actin and myosin do is they allow for muscle to not only have elastic energy, but they allow for muscle to create a force. And the way they do it is that actin and myosin, they end up intertwining. Right now, this is at a relaxed state. You'll see there's a space here between the actin and the myosin. All right, now on the actin are these two molecules called troponin and tropomyosin. And right now, troponin and tropomyosin are not touching. They're not intertwining with each other. But when calcium comes in, what it does is it makes troponin and tropomyosin intertwine with each other. And that moves the actin heads closer to the myosin heads, and then they interact and they connect with each other. And then when they interact and connect with each other, if there's ATP and then there's energy available, then that energy is going to result in some type of movement. Like we said, energy results in movement. The movement is that these cross bridges that are in this angle are going to flip to the opposite angle. So this cross bridge is going to go from that direction to this direction, to this direction. And this one's going to go to that direction and that actually bad color. Undo, undo, undo. Let's just use a different color. So they're going to change to this direction. So the cross bridges are going to flip. Now this globule, instead of being in this direction, the globule is going to switch. The utilization of ATP is going to result in the motion of that cross bridge in that direction. It's going to result in the motion of this cross bridge into this direction. So all of these cross bridges are going to go in this direction, and all of the opposite side cross bridges are going to go in that direction. And what's going to happen is it's going to take all of this stuff and pull it that way, and all of that stuff and pull it this way. And these filaments, the myosin and actin, are literally going to slide across each other and make a contraction. Once it slides, it releases its grip. It moves back in this direction. It grabs another head and it pulls back in this direction and pulls back in this direction and pulls back. And that's how your muscles continue to contract. Right? It's each actin and myosin head is making connection and pulling, making a connection and pulling, and making a connection and pulling pretty much. Right? So that's the principle of how this is all happening. The motion, the movement that is utilizing ATP is this motion from this to there. And what happens is, well, I'll show you in the next couple of slides. So it all starts with a motor unit, though. And now the book kind of like goes back and explains things from the brain a little bit. And now this is where it starts to get a little bit fun. Although it was fun before there, Alice. It was fun before. But look at this. It says neuromuscular. Now, how is all of this happening? How did that sliding filament theory happen? How did the sliding filament theory, it was easy for me to say it on the Zoom and to draw it out for you, but then to conceptualize it in your head, how that all happens. Well, what we think here is that you have the brain, and like we said before, the brain is responsible for sending all of the signals through its alpha motor neuron, and that's going to go all the way down through the spinal cord, and eventually it's going to get to a muscle. Right? But how does that happen? It's a muscle fiber. Eventually it's going to get into your sarcomeres. And then when that alpha motor neuron gets into the sarcomeres, it's going to lead to a contraction, either a concentric or an eccentric or an isometric or some other contraction. But for the most part, we're going to talk about concentric and eccentric contractions. All right. So how does that happen? Well, you have an alpha motor neuron. An alpha motor neuron is the neuron that's coming from the frontal lobe, and it's going to innervate some muscle fibers. Now, you have some very, very small motor units, like the motor units that control your eyes and the blinking of your eyes. Very, very, very small motor units. It might be a very small motor neuron and very few fibers. And small motor units are available for small, dexterous activities. But you might have, like, your quads or your glutes are going to be very big, powerful motor units. They're going to be a big, much bigger neuron itself, and it's going to innervate many different fibers. So bigger motor units equal more force. It's like having one person who's pulling the tug of war, or 100 people pulling the tug of war. If you have 100 people, you're able to make more, like, connections between you and the rope. If you have, one strand of rope, it's going to fray. But if I have 100 strands of rope, it just can make more tension. So it's the bigger the unit, the bigger the motor unit, and the bigger the neuron, the more contractile force there is. Now it starts talking about this neuromuscular junction. And remember, I said that once you start to make a system out of things, then what happens is you get these things like length that emerges. You get things like slope that emerges. Where did these things come from? Well, they came from this organization of things into systems. Now, how is it that when you organize things into systems that you get these emergent properties? Honestly, I have no idea how the universe got set up that way, but it seems as though we've already shown you that you do get these emergent properties. And then all of a sudden they have this curious word, neuromuscular junction. First of all, the junction between the neuron, this is the brain, right? The brain and the muscles. So the brain and the muscles. The brain and the muscles. Not the brain itself and the muscles itself, but the brain and the muscle. And they use this O here, the cardiovascular, the neuromuscular, the neuroendocrine, right? They even have these systems here blatantly out in front of you, pointing to the systems theory. And they still don't understand it's the organization of the system that allows for this sliding filament theory to happen, not the brain doing it. It's the fact that the brain and the muscle are a system. They're connected to each other via neurons, via these synapses, via electricity, via physical tissues. They're not separate things. They're the same thing. They are a neuromuscular junction or system, or the connection between this incredibly complicated brain and this incredibly complicated muscular system. What emerges from that? That's where movement's coming from. I don't know how that's happening, right? This right over here is the brain. This over here is the muscle. And what's emerging is the muscle's movement. It's not the brain sending the signal. It's a different concept. I know it's a little bit deep, but rather than thinking about the brain being the initiator of all of this sliding filament theory, that's why it's theoretical, because we still don't get what the brain's doing. Now, I understand that that systems theory is also theoretical, but I can at least explain these emergent properties. I can at least explain how the muscle is contracting and how the 480 muscles can all of a sudden emergently contract all at the same time, it's because the brain and the muscles and the environment and you are working within systems, and it emerges. It's impossible to think of this all happening all on its own. There is a connection, though, between the brain and the muscle, and the connection between the two is electricity. And electricity is energy. It's electrical energy. Electricity. Electricity. This is energy. And this electrical energy is going to be utilized in the muscle fiber, again, to make the actin and myosin cross bridges switch so that there can be a contraction. But you don't eat electricity. You eat carbohydrate, protein, fat, and that stuff has to be converted to electricity. We'll talk about that in the next chapter, but the next chapter is called bio, which is living things, bioenergetics, bioenergy. Where does living stuff, and we're going to talk about human beings, where does living stuff get energy? Well, it gets it from calories and switches it to electricity. And what I think the brain does, I don't think that the brain sends anything. I think that the brain is just this big well of electricity. Just like you have the electrical department of a town stores the electricity, and when you need it, you can tap into it. But the electrical department isn't sending all of the signals to the town, just holds the signal for the town. That's what I think the brain is. So you have these motor units. Here's another drawing of what a motor unit would look like here. So you have your alpha motor neuron that's coming from the brain, cell body, dendrites. These are coming from other neurons innervating this neuron. Then you're going to have your axon. And then at the end of the axon, you'll have your axon terminals. All right, this is a terminal. This is like the end of something. At the end of your axon terminal, you're going to have your the junction or the connection between your neuron and your muscle, your neuromuscular junction. And in this junction, this connection between the neuron and the muscle is where acetylcholine and dopamine are going to go. Now, I'm not sure if you are aware of these protective sheaths that surround the motor neuron, but these are called myelin. When myelin is destroyed, it's the precursor for multiple sclerosis. All right, so what myelin does is, you could imagine, it takes time for the electrical impulse, once it leaves the motor neuron, even though electricity goes fast, it takes time for the action potential to go all the way down the neuron and get to the muscle. Even if it takes, a couple of milliseconds, it still takes time. If it took too much time, then there would be a delay between what you thought or what you intended for your body to do and the actual movement that occurred. So you want to get this signal to the muscles super, super fast. And then the way that the electricity goes from one end of the neuron to the other end of the neuron is by these changes in electrical charge caused by calcium sodium and potassium going in and out of the cells into the fluid outside of the cells. So there needs to be a change in sodium, potassium, sodium, potassium, sodium, potassium, sodium, potassium, sodium, potassium, sodium, potassium, sodium, potassium. And you can imagine that interchange has to go down the entire length of the neuron, and that's going to take time. So what the myelin does is it makes it so that the electrical signal can jump this gap. It jumps the gap, jumps the gap, jumps the gap. So instead of having to make changes between potassium and sodium along the entire length of the motor neuron, it only has to make that change 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 relative times in this drawing compared to 100 all the way down the neuron. So what myelin does is it makes it so that the propagation or the movement of the electrical signal, the action potential down the axon happens much faster than it would if the myelin wasn't there. And now you could imagine what would happen if the myelin started to deteriorate. It would negatively impact the ability for not just this action potential, but if other alpha motor neurons had myelin problems, the concert of propagation that was affected negatively would result into dyskinetic movements and difficulty moving, and that's what MS is. So then you have back here. So now what we want to do is we want to take a look even further at what happens at this neuromuscular junction. All right, so I'm going to show you the next slide. The next slide starts with this fun little word here. And this is the whole problem with the sliding filament theory, is that it says that the action potential starts in the brain. Right, but like I've never been aware of that before. So the sliding filament theory breaks down because of this very thing. But let's assume that it does. Let's assume that the action potential starts in the brain. How it starts in the brain, nobody in this class will ever be able to understand. But let's assume that it starts here. The action potential is going to go down the motor neuron, and it's eventually going to release acetylcholine. Now, this is the axon terminal. When the action potential gets to the end of the neuron, it's going to release acetylcholine. Now, acetylcholine works opposite of another chemical messenger in the body called dopamine. I'm sure people have heard of dopamine. Now, what acetylcholine does is it makes the action potential, maybe might not have a dopamine, yeah, me. What acetylcholine does is it helps this action potential go across the axon terminal and go from the neuron into the muscle, and it helps enable a muscle contraction. So it's acetylcholine that's going to go across the axon terminal. Now, in order to stop this from occurring, dopamine is flooded into this axon terminal, and it reverses the process. That's why somebody who has Parkinson's disease, who has a deterioration of the basal ganglia, which is some part in the middle of the brain that creates dopamine. That's why when somebody who has Parkinson's disease and they don't have enough dopamine, there's too much of this excitatory neuromuscular transmitter and not enough to shut off the excitement. And so they have the tremors. All right. Or they also have potentially muscles that have increased stiffness. And increased stiffness, we already talked about with the stress strain curves. Increased stiffness of muscles means that whereas somebody else's stress strain curve for their muscle was like this, somebody who has Parkinson's disease is super stiff. So their muscles aren't as flexible or can't elastically store energy. And because of that, they can't be used as pendulums as effectively, and they get much stiffer. All right. So now what will happen is the axon or the action potential will release acetylcholine, and acetylcholine is going to allow for calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's the yellow stuff that was surrounding the muscle fiber. And when calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it allows for that troponin and tropomyosin to intertwine. And when that happens, actin and myosin interact, and then you have the change in angle of the cross bridges. And that's at least what they say is a muscle contraction. That's what happens with this sliding filament theory. Now, this is just another drawing of it. Let me clear all this. So you have your motor neuron, and inside the motor neuron, at the end of the axon, the termination of the axon, you have these like pockets. They're called storage vesicles. And in the storage vesicles is where your acetylcholine is. Acetylcholine is released from these storage vesicles. And on the edge of the muscle fiber, there's going to be a receptor for acetylcholine. For people who have dopamine, their dopamine receptors are deteriorating, or they don't have as many, or they're not as receptive to dopamine. So that's what's causing Parkinson's, tremors, or the dyskinesia from Parkinson's. So this is everything at play. Then what will happen is these acetylcholine molecules are going to allow for a release of calcium from the T-tubules in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the calcium is going to flood into your sarcomeres, into the muscle fibers itself. The calcium is going to allow for troponin and tropomyosin to slide over each other, and that's going to make it so that actin and myosin connect, bunk, and when they connect and slide on each other, now what's going to happen is this site is now activated, and this cross bridge right over here is going to potentially change its angle of orientation and result in a contraction. I'm pretty sure if I go like this and I go I could go like open hyperlink. It's going to screw everything up, but whatever.
In response to an action potential, a motor neuron releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine crosses the synaptic cleft and binds to receptors on the plasma lemma. If enough acetylcholine binds to the receptors, an action potential is generated and transmitted along the full length of the muscle fiber. The action potential triggers the release of calcium ions from the terminal cisterna of the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the sarcoplasm. In the resting state, tropomyosin molecules cover the myosin binding sites on the actin molecules of each sarcomere, preventing the binding of the myosin heads. Once calcium ions are released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, they bind to the troponin on the actin molecules. Troponin, with its strong affinity for calcium ions, is believed to then initiate the contraction process by moving the tropomyosin molecules off the myosin binding sites on the actin molecules, allowing myosin heads to attach to the actin filaments.
I couldn't have said it better myself. All right, let's go over here. So you have our action potential is getting to your sarcoplasmic reticulum from the T-tubule. And then calcium. Calcium is released into the muscle fiber. And then calcium is going to slide troponin over. That allows for actin and myosin to bind. All right, let's just keep moving on. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is what I was saying before. I think we need to get into it so far, but let's get into this stuff more. This stuff's more fun. I think that's enough. All right, so then when your muscle is going to relax, what has to happen is this calcium needs to get sucked back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. In order for that to happen, there needs to be energy. But when you're dead and you're not like burning ATP anymore, and you can't use energy, or there's no more energy to get the calcium out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, then your body stays in a state of muscle contraction and can't relax. Because when you're dead, you can't create any more energy. And that's pretty much what rigor mortis is. All right, so in order for your muscle to relax, you need to get rid of this calcium. One of the things that helps with that is magnesium. So if you're an athlete and you find that you get a lot of cramps, could be that you need to drink more water, but it could be the case that you just don't have enough magnesium. And what magnesium does is it helps pull calcium back out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Out of the muscle back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now we have different types of muscle fibers. There's different types of activities. There's some activities need a lot of endurance, or some activities are low intensity, but longer in duration. And other activities are short in duration, but very high intensity. And you have different types of muscle fibers for that very reason. And you are aware of the different types of muscle fibers that you have. I'm sure that some people like dark meat and some people like light meat. Well, those are the two different types of muscle fibers right there. Type 1 muscle fiber types are called slow twitch muscle fiber types. Slow twitch. They contract somewhat slower, and they're utilized for slower motions, slower movements, like endurance stuff. Let's get rid of that. They're slow muscle fiber types. They're utilized for things like running, low intensity. They use oxygen very well. And because they use oxygen very well, they have lots of hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is stuff in your blood that carries oxygen to your muscle cells. So there's increased, I'm just going to write HM for hemoglobin, increased hemoglobin. And the number one thing is that they use oxygen very well. So individuals who are really good runners are typically good runners because they like running, but they like running because they're good at it, and they're good at it because predominantly they would most likely have more type 1 muscle fiber types. Now, when you're born, you have a particular percentage of type 1 and type 2 muscle fiber types. Most people have about 50-50, and that percentage is not changed throughout the course of your life, even if you work out. Usually you have the same amount. Now you can make the muscle fiber types more effective, but typically the number of muscle fibers and the ratio is pretty much set because of genetics. Type 1 muscle fiber types are used for endurance, and type 2 muscle fiber types are used for power. And we'll get into the difference between power and strength and stuff later on. That's not important for right now. But these are powerful. Because of that, they use ATP very, very effectively. They have enzymes that break down ATP very quickly. And usually when you work resistance training, these muscles go through hypertrophy training or hypertrophy. They get bigger, so they grow. When you work on type 1 muscle fiber types, they don't typically get much bigger, but they do get better at utilizing oxygen. They grow more mitochondria. They grow more blood vessels. The blood vessels get bigger. So when you work on type 1 muscle fiber types, they utilize oxygen better. And when you work on type 2 muscle fiber types, they get bigger. Now, type 2 muscle fiber types, these are called also fast twitch because they contract much faster than slow twitch muscle fiber types. And typically your muscles are going to have a good amount of type 1 muscle fiber types because you walk and your whole body has to walk. And walking is a very low intensity activity. So for your body to at least do the 10,000 steps a day, many of your muscles have a combination of type 1 and type 2 muscle fiber types. Now, there is very little evidence that type 2 muscle fiber types and type 1 muscle fiber types can turn into each other. But these type 2A and X muscle fiber types are kind of like almost combinations between type 2 and type 1, and there is some crossover here. Now, you all are aware of type 1 and type 2 muscle fiber types. There's a lot of hemoglobin in type 1 muscle fiber types. And we know hemoglobin carries blood, and blood is red. So you'll have some muscles that have more hemoglobin, which are type 1 muscle fiber types. And because they're more hemoglobin, they're going to look darker. And then you're going to have other muscles that have less hemoglobin, and they're going to look lighter. It's the difference between dark meat and light meat. Now, a chicken has both dark meat and light meat. A duck only has dark meat, though. Why would a duck only have dark meat? Well, because a chicken doesn't have to migrate. A duck migrates. The duck is going to have to migrate. They're going to have to fly for a long period of time at a low intensity. And what makes those wings flap is it's the chest muscles, the breast muscles. So for a duck's breast muscles or chest muscles have to have more hemoglobin than a chicken. So a duck has all dark meat. Right? Duck has all dark meat because a duck migrates and it has to use its chest muscles for a long period of time so that it can fly that far. But a chicken barely flies. I don't even know if chickens fly. I have no idea. Right? But a chicken doesn't have to fly. A chicken has to run away from you very quickly. But a chicken's wings don't really do much. So a chicken's chest meat has much less hemoglobin, and all it really needs to do is just flap its wings very quickly and its legs very quickly. So it has its thighs are dark meat, but its chest is all now just type 1 low intensity, just sit there and do nothing. I mean, sorry. Do nothing, don't have to break down oxygen. And if it needs to run and flap its wings very, very quickly and get out of there, it's fine. So its chest now is all light meat, no hemoglobin, right? Its legs though, because its legs sit there and like walk and cluck all day. Its leg meat is dark meat because it just sits there and walks all day. But so we're all aware of dark meat. I'm a big fan of light meat myself. Now, there are other differences between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, but you can really only figure that out through muscle biopsy. We don't do muscle biopsies in our labs, so, but you can kind of take a look at some individuals and make some hypothesis of whether or not they're type 1 or type 2 muscle fiber types. For instance, there's some kids in the gym, they have, like the really compressed muscles. Some kids have the longer muscle types. So I would say that that's probably an indicator there. And you can also see which kids respond to strength and conditioning with like kettlebells and hypertrophy training more so than others. Let's see where we're at. So typically type 2 muscle fiber types are going to have a higher developed sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's because they're involved in powerful activities. Type 2 is fast twitch, power activities. So they have to have a faster release of calcium into from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the muscle fibers. So because of that, type 2 muscle fiber types will have a more highly developed or dense sarcoplasmic reticulum. And type 2 muscle fiber types are typically going to have larger motor neurons and a larger neuron, all right, because they need to be more powerful. So bigger fibers, your quads, your hamstrings, your glute medius, your biceps, triceps. Smaller motor neurons are going to be your smaller motor units, potentially things like your forearms, your intercostal muscles, or your saccadic rhythms in your eyes and such like that. What are we at here? So there are other differences between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So you would think that type 1 muscle fiber types are for endurance. So you would think that many of the things that would require or that would result in better utilization of oxygen would be things that type 1 muscle fiber types have as their best characteristics. So type 1 muscle fiber types, typically they're able to break down oxygen for fuel very, very well. They are not able to. Glyco is sugar, and lytic is lysing something. So the breaking apart of sugars for fuel, type 1 muscle fiber types, not as good. They're better at, now this is glycolytic. This is utilizing sugar without oxygen. This is utilizing sugars, fats, proteins with oxygen. Very good at doing that. Contractile speed, the ability for the action potential to course through the sarcomere and for the actin and myosin to intertwine, make a contraction, reconnect, make another contraction, reconnect, make another contraction. Much slower for type 1 muscle fibers, but they are able to utilize and recycle ATP much faster. So they get tired much less. They utilize oxygen, much more effectively than type 2 muscle fiber types. Type 2 muscle fiber types they are not able to utilize oxygen as effectively, but they are able to break down sugars, especially without the presence of oxygen, much faster than type 1 muscle fiber types. So anything, and when you exercise or when you work on type 1 muscle fibers, typically they're going to get better and stronger at these particular characteristics. So if I work on endurance muscles, slow twitch muscle fiber types, they're not going to get much bigger and stronger. If I work on type 2 muscle fiber types, they're not going to get better typically at their oxidative capacity. They will to some extent, but not as much as their counterparts. And each person has different ratios of this fiber types, but that ratio doesn't really change too much. For endurance athletes, they're endurance athletes because when they started running at a young age, they were good at it. So why were they good at it? Well, they're good at it probably because their musculature, their structure was able to complement their function. And the function was to run or to get medals or to win a race or whatever. So typically those individuals who have a large amount of type 1 muscle fiber types and are able to run and are successful at it gravitate towards endurance sports and likewise. So usually individuals in gymnastics are good at gymnastics because they're powerful, and they're powerful because they have type 2 muscle fiber types, and typically those are more compressed. So is it that gymnastics makes you short, or is it that short people who have more compressed muscle fiber types and less torque are typically more successful? So it's like a chicken versus the egg thing. It is the case, though, that for everybody, certain muscles have particular ratios of type 1 versus type 2 muscle fiber types. So, for instance, the soleus is predominantly type 1 muscle fiber types for everybody. The soleus is one of your calf muscles, right? And you're using your calf muscles to walk and take your 10,000 steps a day. So for everybody, there's going to be a need for the soleus to be able to accommodate that. So there is a good amount of type 1 muscle fiber types in the soleus for everybody. All right. Typically, your type 1 muscle fiber types are going to have smaller motor neurons, smaller motor units. Motor unit size are going to be smaller. All right, these are going to be larger because they need to be more powerful and faster. Anyway, I think we're getting into the boring part. Type 1 fiber types are much more aerobic. Aerobic means oxygen. They could use oxygen better. They have better enzymes to break down oxygen. And the reason why you're breaking down oxygen is so that you can use ATP for energy. All right. Type 1 muscle fiber types are going to be very effective at utilizing energy from carbohydrates and from fat. And we'll talk about probably the last half of this today's class. We'll talk about carbohydrate, protein, and fat and getting energy from those. Your type 1 muscle fiber types get energy from fat and carbohydrate. Typically, carbohydrate is fuel. It's like gasoline. All right. Your body wants to store fat. Fat is important. Fat is the structural component of all of the cell walls. So you don't want to get rid of fat. Fat is important. All right. Type 1 muscle fiber types predominantly want to use carbohydrate for fuel, but it can use fat for fuel if it doesn't have enough carbohydrate. It doesn't want to use protein for fuel because protein costs the body energy to use. So it's like you're like wasting energy to use energy, so the body doesn't like to do it. For the most part, your type 2 muscle fiber types are going to be very poor at utilizing oxygen. They get tired very quickly. But some type 2A muscle fiber types can utilize oxygen better than regular type 2 muscle fiber types, but we don't really talk too much about the difference between type 2 and A and X muscle fiber types. The main factors that determine the concentration of fiber types in a body are genetic and somewhat training. There is some evidence that there can be a potential to change fiber types, but no more than 10% of a change. So a lot of the strength and conditioning focus out there is not on this change in fiber type, because if you do, it's only going to target 10% of the increase in strength anyhow. So for the most part, we can kind of assume that the fiber type percentage that you have at birth is pretty similar to what you're going to have throughout life. Typically, you'll like a movement, even if you're going to do like a clean and jerk, even if you're going to do something like the biggest motion in the, like, typically it starts with a very small, very low intensity movement. So the first motor units, or the first muscle types that are innervated in any movement are always type 1 muscle fiber types. And then as the motor, or as the demand of the movement becomes more forceful and more force is needed, then and only then will the type 2 muscle fiber types start to be innervated. So if the movement that you're requiring needs very little force production, then few and small motor units will be innervated. All right, where are we? And don't be afraid. Like if you're an endurance athlete and you don't have, you know, as many type 1 muscle fiber types as the person that you're competing with, that's not the only thing that you can rest your laurels on, right? You have cardiovascular fitness, you have your ability to perform your exercises with technique, with efficiency, you have hydration, motivation, you have friends, you have emotional well-being, you have all sorts of different things. So it's not that your genetically determined percentage of fiber types is the be all and end all, but it is genetically determined. Then we start talking about muscle contractions. So we'll talk about these. You have some muscle contractions that are static and some that are dynamic. We won't talk too much about static muscle contractions, but iso means the same, and metric means like length or distance or measurement. So a static muscle contraction is a muscle contraction like this. So this is my humerus, this is my ulna and radius, this is my hand, these are my fingers here, I hate this thing here. And this is my bicep. I should have made these other colors. This is my bicep. Now, if I was holding a coffee cup in my hand, and the coffee cup is neither, and my hand is neither extending, nor am I flexing my arm. My coffee cup is just staying right there. This muscle is firing. It's contracting. It's just contracting with a force in this direction that equals the torque created by the coffee cup in that direction. So there's no resultant movement either way. It would be a static, a no movement contraction in which the length or the measurement of my muscle remains iso, which is the same. It's called an isometric contraction. There is a force, but there is no sliding. The cross bridges are not sliding across each other. But we're going to talk about dynamic muscle contractions. Dynamic is ever changing. That's what dynamic means. And those examples are concentric, and eccentric. Now, a concentric muscle contraction is with the center, with the center. So in a concentric muscle contraction, the muscle goes towards the center, goes with the center, and it gets shorter. Then you have an eccentric muscle contraction, eccentric. Now, these days, I consider myself more and more, I guess, eccentric, and that's actually not a bad thing anymore. It's actually a good thing, but typically if you're eccentric, people like actually want to like be away from you. So that's at least how I thought of it. So an eccentric muscle contraction, everything goes away from the center and elongates. So concentric is with the center and eccentric is away from the center. But there's a bigger and more important reason to talk about those two. And in order to kind of talk about exercise physiology and the wellness and the health of the body, we need to talk about them a little bit more in depth. So let's go to our next slide. A concentric muscle contraction is with the center, and the muscle shortens. Why does it do that? And the muscle shortens. Yeah, just a little bit, whatever. The muscle shortens. But what's interesting is that it produces a force. Now I'm gonna put this here, admit. I'm gonna put this letter here, G, for generate. I'm gonna put this here, absorb. This one here is, the muscle is, again, producing a force, but it's getting longer. This is lowering a heavy weight. So here, a concentric muscle contraction would be, this is an example of a concentric muscle contraction. Concentric muscle contraction. They're our friend. All right, so a concentric muscle contraction would be a muscle contraction where, let's say I have a barbell. I'm holding on to a dumbbell. All right, and I'm gonna pull the dumbbell in, let's get just a different color here, in this direction. A bicep curl. It's going to make it so that this muscle is, if this muscle gets shorter, it's going to take the ends of the muscle and pull in this direction here. And that's going to pull this lever, which is attached here. It's going to pull it up in this direction. Now, gravity is taking this weight and pulling down in that direction. Every concentric muscle contraction goes against the pull of gravity, if you think about it. Gravity is always pulling down, and every concentric muscle contraction pulls against the grip of gravity. Gravity is pulling down, but your muscle needs to generate power. It needs to generate enough power to overcome the pull of gravity. A concentric muscle contraction generates power and overcomes gravity's pull. An eccentric muscle contraction is the opposite. An eccentric muscle contraction, let me erase this here. The weight is being pulled down by gravity. And although I am contracting the muscle is elongating. It's getting longer and longer. And what it's really doing is it's slowing down, or it's absorbing the pull of gravity. Absorbing. So an eccentric muscle contraction is always going against gravity. Is absorbing gravity, or is reducing the pull of gravity. And a concentric muscle contraction is pulling against or generating a force away from gravity. Another way that you can think about it is a concentric muscle contraction is the gas pedal generating power, overcoming the grip of gravity so that you can move. And the eccentric contraction is the brake pedal. And like when a car is careening down a road and gravity and momentum are taking that car and moving it, well, then you need a brake pedal to slow that down. If the car is totally still, I need to overcome or generate power to get the car to move. I need a gas pedal. Or if the car is already moving and I need to absorb that power, I need a brake pedal. Concentric muscle contractions generate power and they act as the gas for the human body. Eccentric muscle contractions, they absorb forces, external forces, and they act as the brake for the human body. Now you have a situation here. What happens if the brake isn't strong enough? All right, well, if the brake isn't strong enough, if the brakes are bad, then I get in an accident. So the eccentric contraction has to have enough strength. The concentric contractions need to have enough strength. Because if they don't have enough strength, then I can't overcome gravity's pull, then I can't do the activity. So I need to have all of my aging population have enough strength so that they can overcome gravity's pull and perform their activities of daily living. So strength is obvious. And when people go to the gym, typically they focus on strength, 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 strength. But another aspect of the interplay between the gas pedal and the brake pedal is not strength at all, it's timing. And this is, I think, a very overlooked aspect of training. What happens if you try to apply the brake pedal in a car and you apply it 1 second too late? What happens? Anybody? Come on, Mike, what happens? What happens if the timing between the gas pedal and the brake pedal is just 1 second too late? What happens?
Well, what happens is either like you're going to crash or like you have to push harder to make up for it.
Absolutely. Either you're going to get in an accident or there's going to be force that goes through the system for too long a period of time and you're going to tear something. So a lot of time people think about going to the gym and just improving strength. And they forget about improving timing. You know, so the timing between concentric and eccentric muscle contraction, not just the intensity or the amplitude of either one of them, but the timing between the two is important. And that's why it's going to be important to make sure that you do good off-season training. And that's why it's important that if my gymnasts, you know, spend Christmas break off, then they don't come back immediately and be expected that they're going to be able to do training without injuring themselves, without being able to slow their body down and absorb forces. Because if they can't absorb forces, like Jameson said, there's going to be some type of accident. So when you go to the gym, not only do you have to work concentric muscle contractions, shortening muscles, but you also have to work eccentric muscle contractions. All right. And let's go and we'll do these last two things. It's 9:53. I'll finish up in 10 minutes and we'll take a quick break and we'll get into the next one. So how does this kind of all relate? Well, we have these two different graphs. This first graph here is called a length tension relationship right here. So this is a length tension relationship for muscle. All right, I'm going to erase this here. Erase all of this. This is what's called a length tension relationship. What does it mean? Let's take a muscle here. So this length is talking about the sarcomere length. This is a sarcomere length can't be 0 centimeters because the muscle will be like puffed into air. So this is the shortest a particular muscle can be. This is the shortest a sarcomere can be. And remember, a sarcomere is your actin and myosin, right? It's this thing right here, the sarcomere. Now it says 5. At 0.5, this is at location 5. This is where the sarcomere, if you look at sarcomere length, this is length. This is getting lower and lower and lower. And if I trace down to the lowest, the sarcomere length is right here. This is 0.5. That's this situation right here. Now I trace all the way over here. Sarcomere length is increasing, 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 increasing. This, if I trace all the way over here, this is as high as the sarcomere is. This is, I guess, situation number 1. Situation number 1. It's the one that just began. That's this situation here. Now let me explain what that means. And let me also explain here. This is the amount of tension. And tension here, we could call force. So this is length, tension, or length force, or force length, or whatever. And it says that if you trace, if you find out where is the most force in the graph is right here. So let's make a little line over here. The most amount of force in the graph is right over here. And you'll notice it's the most amount of force in the graph is kind of like around this area here where it says 2 and 3. So right about here, let's just check those off. So it says that I can produce how much force? In this spot at situation number 5, I can produce 0 force. And at this spot of the graph, likewise, I can produce 0 force. So what does that mean? That means at situation 5 and situation 1, my muscles cannot produce any force at all. What does that mean and why? Well, I'll explain it to you. Let's start with situation number 1. That's when the muscle is elongated as much as it can be. So I'll show you that. Undo that. Let's just use a different color. So this is your humerus. Humerus. This is your elbow. And this is your ulna and radius. Sorry, it's not a great drawing. Sorry, my bad, my bad. My bad. And this is my hand. Actually, one second. Let's do this. I may as well make them good. A good drawing. If it's good, then it'll be better, by definition. So here's my humerus. This is my elbow, my ulna and radius. This is my hand. And now up here is going to be my bicep. And this is where my arm is fully extended, fully extended. My arm is like completely fully extended like that. That's where your bicep is as long as it will ever be. That's where the bicep, the length of your bicep over here, the sarcomere length of that particular bicep is going to be as long as it's ever been. Now, if my arm is flexed all the way up here, and my hand is here, then my bicep is going to be super, super small. It's going to be as contracted as it's ever been. It's going to be kind of like this, as contracted as it's ever been. That's going to be this situation here, where the sarcomere length is as short as it can be. So the sarcomere length as long as it, 1 second, mouse, hopefully it works, nice. The sarcomere length as long as it can be would be my arm fully extended, my muscles are completely fully extended, and my actin and myosin are so far away from each other that they can't even touch. That's the sarcomere length being as long as it can possibly be. And that's station number 1, where the actin and myosin are so far away from each other that there's barely any overlap between the actin and myosin. Very little actin and myosin are touching each other. Because in situation number 1, very little actin and myosin are actually overlapping and intertwining, it can't make a very forceful contraction. It can't make a very strong contraction there. Actin and myosin aren't touching each other. Likewise, now in situation, that's where the muscle is going to be too elongated. That's the muscle too elongated. That's this situation here. That's the blue. The muscle is too elongated. And when the muscle is too elongated, I can't make a forceful contraction because the actin and myosin aren't able to reach each other. Now let's go to situation number 5. That's when the sarcomere length is as low as possible. That's when the muscle is as contracted as possible. That's this situation here, where the muscle is fully contracted, fully contracted. That's why you also don't grab a bag of rice with your arm fully contracted either, because when you're fully contracted, now the actin and myosin have actually passed over each other. There's too much overlap, right? That's why when you contract your muscle like that, you don't hold something with your arm completely contracted like that, because now some of the actin and myosin is too far away from each other on the overlap section. Before, when your muscle's too elongated, it can't reach each other. Now it's past each other too far. So when your muscle is totally elongated, too stretched out, all right, I can erase this. All right, when your muscle is totally elongated here, all right, it's the same thing as saying your arm is completely extended. The actin and myosin just can't reach each other. And because of that, they cannot produce an active contraction. When your muscle is, again, too contracted, too far contracted, then again, the actin and myosin cannot intertwine because they've overlapped each other too much. So they can also, again, not make an active contraction. But when the muscle is right in the middle of its length, when the muscle is right in the middle of its resting length, then all of the actin and all of the myosin can intertwine with each other. And when that happens, when the muscle is kind of like in this orientation here, when the arm is like this, now all of a sudden you have a situation where the actin and myosin can intertwine with each other. Right now, this muscle here is going to be right in the middle of its length. It's neither too small, neither too big. It's like the Goldilocks paradigm. You know, it's right in the middle. And in situation 2, 3, and 4, most of the actin and most of the myosin can intertwine with each other. And because of that, I can make a pretty forceful contraction. In fact, I can make the most forceful contraction if this is my entire length is represented from here to here. Then when my muscle, half of that, when my muscle is right about here, at about 50% of its length is when a muscle can produce the most amount of force. And that's because most of the actin and myosin can intertwine at that particular angle. Now, that's why you catch or you hold something with your arms at 90 degrees, not because your brain told you to do it. It's because your actin and myosin need to intertwine And if you don't hold it at 90 degrees, you'll just drop whatever it is that you want to hold. And that's counterproductive to the task that you have. I've never thought of 90 degrees, but if I don't do it at 90 degrees, usually what ends up happening is I'll tear my bicep. Right? So to me, I think that the function and the way that I use my body is not necessarily a function of what my brain is telling my body to do, but it's more of a function of how my body is designed and the structure of my body. I'll do one last thing because we have one more slide to go through with this particular presentation. And then maybe we'll give you guys a couple minutes rest. But this slide here is also pretty interesting. And this is going to have a lot to do with how you help your athletes in the gym. So right now you have, this is called, so we just talked about the length tension relationship of muscle. This is the length tension relationship. There's also more to this length tension relationship, but I think that will be done for here. We also have this relationship. This is the force velocity relationship of muscle, the force velocity relationship. And this has a lot to do with how the muscle can utilize ATP, regenerate the cross bridge, and go from this angle back to this angle, attach to another head of myosin, and then go back to the other angle. So it has a lot to do with the recycling of these actin and myosin cross bridges. But anyway, let's just get into this here. Let's just take a look at one side of this graph before the other. So if I look at this here, here I'll go. So this instead. Let's just take a look at one side. It's much easier to see it if we separate it. It gets less confusing. So this is the concentric side. The concentric side. Then you'll notice if you look, this graph here is force. So force gets higher and higher and higher. Yeah, use green on green. That's a good idea. The force gets higher and higher and higher as you go up this way. And the velocity gets higher and higher as you go this way. So this is like if I move my muscles super, super slow. If I do a bicep curl and I'm curling very, very slow, my motion is slow. Or this is if I do a bicep curl and I move very, very quickly. And this is a concentric muscle contraction. It says, where are concentric muscle contractions most forceful? All right, well, let's go to the force line. Well, it's not as forceful down here. It gets more and more and more. Ooh, okay, so if I go all the way up here, this is where the line is the most forceful. So I noticed that most force in a concentric muscle contraction comes at low velocities. Most force at low velocities. And if I'm moving my arm very quickly and doing a concentric muscle contraction very quickly, my muscle is actually not as forceful. So if I'm doing a bicep curl, all right, a bicep curl here, that looks like a little bit of a broken arm, my bad, but if I have a bicep curl and I'm going in the concentric direction, so I'm going in the away from the ground direction, so I'm going in this direction, in that direction there, typically doing that bicep curl slower is going to make it much easier than if I do it faster. And that's why you see when people do a bicep curl, they typically do it relatively slow, because your concentric muscle contractions work more forcefully, naturally, at slower velocities. Well, what we would want to do is maybe make it so, well, let's just keep going. All right, so concentric muscle contractions work best at lower velocities, and they're not very good at working at higher velocities. So let's take this here and let's clear this drawing here. And let's draw this here and cover this up. Now the opposite is true for eccentric muscle contractions. If you follow where eccentric muscle contractions are more forceful, you'll notice now eccentric muscle contractions are more forceful here, and they're more forceful at, now even though this is, they're more forceful at, again, higher velocities. Now you would say, well, how is this velocity in this direction? And this is velocity in this direction? Well, in exercise physiology, remember, a velocity is a distance equals rate times time. So distance equals rate times time. Therefore, rate, which is velocity, is equal to distance divided by time equals rate. And how does rate become negative? Well, if the distance was negative. And how does distance become negative? Well, if it goes backwards. So in exercise physiology and muscle contraction, when a muscle contraction changes its distance in this direction, it's known as a positive distance. And when it is in the opposite, in the eccentric direction, it's known as a negative distance. So a muscle that moves in the positive direction would have a positive D and a positive distance, and therefore it would have a positive velocity. Therefore, it would be on this side of the zero. And a muscle contraction that happens in the eccentric contraction direction would have a negative distance, and therefore it would have a velocity listed on the opposite side of zero. So that's what that means. Just means, if you notice here, though, that eccentric muscle contractions are very forceful at very high velocities. Like when I'm jumping off of a rock wall and I'm going to land on the ground, I don't want that absorption, the eccentric muscle contraction, to take a very long time. I want that to work very quickly, boom, and absorb that landing quickly. Eccentric muscle contractions are very forceful. In fact, if you look at eccentric muscle contractions compared to concentric muscle contractions, they're much more forceful always. But they're used for different things. They're much more forceful at absorbing things, and these are much more forceful at generating power. But what we do in the gym is a little bit counterintuitive to here. What we do in the gym is we reverse it. So we reverse this paradigm. What we do is we tell you that we want you to do your pull-ups very fast on the way up and slow on the way down. Why would we do that? Well, because your muscles are already strong at going at low velocities. So if you can work your concentric muscle contractions at higher velocities, then you can increase the overall strength profile of the muscle. So you're trying to get the muscle to kind of look more like this here. And you're trying to increase the overall strength profile. And you're also, by doing the eccentric slow, you're starting to try to pick up this part of the graph. So eventually we're trying to create, like increases in this area here and in this area here. And that's how to use the force velocity curve and the understanding of the function of muscle and eccentric and concentric muscle contractions to improve the overall strength profile of your athlete, understanding how force and velocity interact. So